The carriages rolled out of Washington in the pre-dawn darkness of July 21st, 1861, filled with congressmen, socialites, and curious civilians clutching picnic baskets and opera glasses. They had come to witness what many believed would be the grand finale of America's brief Civil War, a splendid military spectacle that would send Confederate rebels scurrying back to their plantations by tea time. Senator Benjamin Wade adjusted his top hat as his carriage bounced along the dusty road toward Manassas Junction, Virginia. Round him, the atmosphere buzzed with carnival-like excitement. Ladies in silk dresses discussed the best vantage points for watching the battle, while gentlemen debated whether the war would truly end before supper. The prevailing wisdom in the capital was clear. One decisive Union victory would crush Southern morale and bring the wayward states crawling back to the fold. But 30 miles southwest, along the meandering creek called Bull Run, a different reality was taking shape. Brigadier General Irvin McDowell's Army of Northeastern Virginia, 35,000 strong, but painfully green, had been marching since July 16th. The men stumbled through the Virginia countryside, their 90-day enlistments ticking away like sand through an hourglass. Most had never fired a shot in anger. Many still struggled to load their muskets properly. Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard had positioned his Army of the Potomac behind Bull Run's natural barrier. 22,000 men stretched along 8 miles of creek banks and ridgelines. Unlike their Union counterparts, many Southern soldiers had been drilling since spring. Their ranks swelled with military academy graduates and Mexican War veterans who understood the deadly arithmetic of 19th century warfare. The morning sun climbed higher as McDowell's columns approached the creek. His plan seemed sound on paper, a diversionary attack at the Stone Bridge, while the main force crossed upstream at Sudley Ford, rolling up the Confederate left flank like a carpet. It was the kind of maneuver that looked brilliant in West Point classrooms, but required precision timing and veteran troops to execute properly. Colonel Ambrose Burnside's Rhode Island Regiment led the advance, their colorful zouave uniforms bright against the summer landscape. Behind them stretched miles of blue-clad soldiers, regimental bands playing patriotic airs, battle flags snapping in the warm breeze. The spectacle was magnificent and tragically deceptive. As the Union columns approached Sudley Ford, Confederate cavalry scouts galloped toward Beauregard's headquarters with urgent dispatches. The element of surprise, crucial to McDowell's success, was already slipping away. Southern signal stations atop nearby hills had been tracking Union movements since dawn, their wigwag flags spelling out warnings that would reshape the day's destiny. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the distant rumble of artillery announced that America's bloodiest conflict had truly begun. The spectators on their hillside perches raised their field glasses expectantly, unaware that they were about to witness not a glorious pageant of Union victory, but the birth of a nightmare that would consume the nation for terrible years. The Sunday picnic war was about to become something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The first shots echoed across Bull Run at 5:30 that morning, but by 10 o'clock, McDowell's carefully orchestrated plan was already unraveling like a poorly wear-upon sweater. Colonel Daniel Tyler's diversionary attack at the Stone Bridge had devolved into a tentative artillery duel, more sound than fury, failing to convince Beauregard that the main Union assault would come there. Meanwhile, the real Union striking force, 13,000 men under Colonel David Hunter and Colonel Samuel Heinzelman, had begun their tortuous march to Sudley Ford 3 miles upstream. What should have been a swift flanking movement became a nightmare of confusion and delay. Untrained soldiers broke ranks to fill canteens, pick berries, or simply rest in whatever shade they could find. Officers consulted maps that bore little resemblance to the actual terrain, leading entire regiments down wrong roads and into impassable thickets. Confederate Colonel Nathan Evans, commanding the forces at Stone Bridge, was no fool. The South Carolinian had fought Seminoles in Florida and knew the difference between a real attack and a feint. When his signal corps reported large Union columns moving toward Sudley Ford, Evans made the boldest decision of his military career. Leaving just 4 companies to hold the bridge, he marched the bulk of his force, barely 900 men, to intercept 13,000 advancing Yankees. The collision came at Matthews Hill around 10:15 in the morning. Evans deployed his men along a ridge overlooking the Warrenton Turnpike, their position anchored by two 6-pound cannons. When Hunter's lead brigade, the 2nd Rhode Island, under Colonel Burnside, emerged from the woods below, Evans ordered his artillery to open fire. The first Confederate cannonball crashed into the Union ranks like a thunderbolt, instantly transforming the morning's casual advance into deadly chaos. Soldiers who had been joking and singing moments before suddenly found themselves sprawled in the dirt, ears ringing, watching comrades writhe in agony. The reality of war, the smell of gunpowder, the screams of wounded men, the sight of blood soaking into Virginia's soil hit the Green troops like a physical blow. According to contemporary accounts documented in the National Tribune, many Union soldiers had never heard a hostile shot fired and were stunned by the intensity of combat. The romantic notions of warfare they had carried from their hometown recruitment rallies evaporated in seconds. Burnside's Rhode Islanders, despite their lack of experience, showed remarkable courage. They deployed from column into line of battle and began advancing up Matthews Hill, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun. But courage alone could not overcome confusion. Companies became separated in the thick woods. Officers lost contact with their men. The carefully rehearsed maneuvers of parade grounds dissolved into desperate improvisation. Evans's outnumbered Confederates fought with the fury of men who knew they stood between the Union Army and Confederate defeat. The 4th South Carolina Infantry, many of them college students who had enlisted with visions of glory, loaded and fired with mechanical precision while cannonballs whistled overhead. Their rifles, many of them hunting weapons brought from home, proved devastatingly effective against Union soldiers silhouetted on the open slope. For nearly an hour, the battle raged across Matthews Hill. Union reinforcements slowly fed into the fight, but Confederate resistance remained fierce. Southern commanders had positioned their men expertly, using every fold in the ground, every fence line and stone wall, to maximum advantage. What had begun as a textbook flanking maneuver was becoming a grinding frontal assault against increasingly desperate defenders. By 11:30, the mathematics of warfare began to tell. Fresh Union brigades arrived to reinforce Burnside's bloodied Rhode Islanders. Evans's gallant 900 could not hold against such overwhelming numbers indefinitely. Reluctantly, the Confederate colonel ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Henry Hill, a mile to the south. The first phase of Bull Run was ending, but the day's bloodiest fighting lay ahead. As Confederate forces retreated from Matthews Hill, Brigadier General Thomas Jonathan Jackson was deploying his Virginia Brigade along the reverse slope of Henry Hill, positioning his men where they could not be seen by advancing Union forces. The 37-year-old professor from Virginia Military Institute had earned a reputation for eccentricity. He sucked on lemons, sat rigidly upright in his saddle, and held one arm aloft during battle, claiming it improved his circulation. But his tactical instincts were flawless. Jackson placed his 2,700 men in a line stretching across the hill's crest, with 5 artillery batteries positioned to sweep the approaches. Behind them, the Henry House, a modest frame dwelling belonging to 85-year-old widow Judith Carter. Henry stood like a lonely sentinel. Mrs. Henry, bedridden and refusing to abandon her home, would become the battle's first civilian casualty when a Union artillery shell crashed through her bedroom. By noon, McDowell's forces had finally achieved what seemed like certain victory. Hunter's and Heintzelman's divisions had successfully flanked the Confederate left, driving Evans's battered command back in disorder. The stone bridge was now undefended. Confederate General Beauregard's entire line appeared on the verge of collapse. Union artillery batteries rolled forward, their crews confident they were delivering the war's knockout blow. Captain Charles Griffin's regular Army battery unlimbered on the northern slope of Henry Hill, barely 300 yards from Jackson's concealed infantry. Griffin was a professional soldier trained at West Point who understood the devastating effect of artillery at close range. His 6 Napoleon cannons began methodically shredding the Confederate position, each round sending geysers of earth and smoke into the sky. But Jackson's men held their ground with supernatural discipline. The Virginia Military Institute graduates, who commanded his regiment's men like Colonel James Allen and Colonel Arthur Cummings, had drilled their soldiers relentlessly. Now that training paid dividends, the Virginians lay pressed against the earth, enduring the artillery bombardment with grim determination, waiting for Jackson's command to counterattack. The moment came when Griffin's battery found itself isolated, its infantry support having drifted away in the confusion of battle. Jackson rose in his stirrups and pointed toward the exposed guns. "Reserve your fire until they come within 50 yards, then fire and give them the bayonet," he shouted. The Virginia Brigade surged over the hilltop like a gray avalanche, their rebel yell echoing across the battlefield for the first time in the war. Griffin's gunners fought heroically, working their cannons until Confederate infantry swarmed among the guns. Hand-to-hand combat raged around the artillery pieces, with soldiers using rammers, handspikes, and bayonets in desperate close quarters fighting. The battery changed hands 3 times in 15 minutes, leaving the ground carpeted with blue and gray bodies. According to battle reports preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the fighting around Griffin's battery marked the battle's turning point, where initial Union advantages began dissolving into costly stalemate. Meanwhile, Confederate reinforcements were arriving from multiple directions. General Joseph Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah, 8,000 fresh troops had slipped away from Union forces in the valley and were detraining at Manassas Junction. Brigadier General Edmund Kirby Smith's brigade quick marched toward the sound of guns, while Colonel Jubal Early's brigade approached from the south. The Union advantage in numbers was evaporating just as McDowell's exhausted soldiers needed it. Many northern regiments had been marching and fighting for over 6 hours in the July heat. Canteens were empty, ammunition was running low, and the 90-day volunteers were beginning to wonder if they had signed up for more than they bargained for. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Henry Hill had become a charnel house. Bodies lay scattered among overturned cannons and abandoned equipment. The sweet smell of summer grass mingled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the metallic stench of blood. What had begun as a glorious adventure was becoming a nightmare that would haunt survivors for decades. The battle's climax was approaching, but victory remained tantalizingly out of reach. For both armies. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the battle's momentum began shifting with seismic force. Colonel Jubal Early's 6th Brigade had completed its grueling march from Union Mills Ford, arriving on the Union right flank just as McDowell's forces were concentrating their final assault on Henry Hill. Early, a 44-year-old lawyer from Franklin County, Virginia, possessed the aggressive instincts of a natural fighter and immediately grasped the tactical situation. Early's 2,400 fresh soldiers deployed in the woods east of Henry Hill, completely undetected by Union commanders who had become fixated on the bloody struggle for the artillery positions. The Confederate colonel studied the battlefield through his field glasses, noting how Union regiments had become intermingled during hours of confused fighting. Officers had lost control of their units. Battle lines had dissolved into clusters of men firing independently. The famous Union discipline was cracking under pressure. The psychological strain on Northern soldiers was becoming visible. Many of the 90-day volunteers had enlisted expecting a brief, glorious campaign that would end with Confederate surrender and triumphant parades through Richmond. Instead, they found themselves locked in desperate combat against enemies who refused to break and run. The romance of war had died somewhere between Matthews Hill and Henry Hill, replaced by the grim realization that Southerners intended to fight. Meanwhile, Confederate morale was soaring. Jackson's Virginia Brigade had earned their commander a new nickname during the desperate fighting around Griffin's battery. When Confederate General Barnard B. saw Jackson's men standing firm under withering Union fire, he reportedly shouted to his own retreating troops, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians, the name would stick." Thomas Jonathan Jackson was now Stonewall, a moniker that would become legendary. At 3 o'clock, Early launched his flanking attack with devastating effect. His Virginians erupted from the tree line with wild rebel yells, striking the exposed Union right like a hammer blow. The 11th New York fires airwaves resplendent in their red pantaloons and tasseled caps, suddenly found Confederate infantry. Pouring into their rear, panic spread through the Union ranks like wildfire. The collapse began with individual soldiers, then spread to entire companies. Men who had fought courageously for hours suddenly threw down their muskets and fled toward the rear. Officers tried desperately to rally their troops, but the psychological dam had burst. The sight of Confederate reinforcements appearing from unexpected directions convinced many Union soldiers that they were surrounded and doomed. Captain James Ricketts's regular Army battery, which had been supporting the Union assault on Henry Hill, found itself cut off and overwhelmed. Ricketts himself fell wounded, along with most of his officers. The precious artillery pieces, the backbone of any Civil War assault, were abandoned to Confederate hands. Without artillery support, Union infantry attacks became impossible against prepared Confederate positions, according to detailed accounts compiled in Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. The psychological impact of losing the artillery proved more devastating than the tactical implications, as it convinced many Union soldiers that defeat was inevitable. McDowell watched his carefully planned offensive disintegrate before his eyes. Hours of fighting had gained him nothing but casualties. His men were exhausted, their ammunition nearly depleted, their confidence shattered. Confederate reinforcements continued arriving, while his own reserves had been fed piecemeal into the meat grinder of Henry Hill. At 4 o'clock, McDowell made the agonizing decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered a general retreat. The Army of Northeastern Virginia, which had marched toward Manassas with such confidence 5 days earlier, would return to Washington in defeat and disgrace. But retreat is one of the most difficult military maneuvers to execute properly, requiring discipline, organization, and steady nerves. McDowell's amateur soldiers possessed none of these qualities. What began as an orderly withdrawal quickly degenerated into something far worse. The disaster was about to begin in earnest. The retreat began with military precision at 4:15 in the afternoon, but within 30 minutes it had transformed into one of the most infamous routes in American military history. McDowell's order to withdraw reached different units at different times, creating a patchwork of confusion across the battlefield. Some regiments received clear instructions and began pulling back in good order. Others heard only rumors and third-hand reports, leading to panic and premature flight. The psychological breaking point came when Confederate artillery opened fire on the Stone Bridge, the main escape route for most Union forces. Captain Edmund Beckham's battery had wheeled into position on a commanding height and began shelling the narrow span with devastating accuracy. The first rounds crashed into retreating Union soldiers, sending bodies tumbling into Bull Run's shallow waters. The sight of escape routes under direct fire triggered mass panic among troops who had already endured 6 hours of combat. Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman's brigade was among the last to receive retreat orders, and Sherman, a future giant of warfare, but then an untested commander, struggled to maintain unit cohesion as his men pulled back from their advanced positions. The red-haired Ohioan had fought well during the day, but even his steady leadership could not prevent the psychological contagion of defeat from spreading through his ranks. The pivotal moment came when a Confederate artillery shell struck an abandoned Union wagon directly on the Stone Bridge, overturning it and completely blocking the narrow passage. Suddenly, thousands of retreating soldiers found themselves trapped on the wrong side of Bull Run, with Confederate cavalry beginning to appear on their flanks. The orderly retreat became a desperate scramble for any available crossing point. Panic spread with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. Soldiers threw away their muskets, cartridge boxes, and knapsacks to run faster. Officers lost all control over their men. Regimental formations dissolved into mobs of frightened individuals, each man concerned only with his own survival. The psychological transformation was complete. The Army of Northeastern Virginia had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force, according to contemporary newspaper accounts, including dispatches published in the New York Tribune. The sight of Union soldiers fleeing in disorder shocked even Confederate observers, who had expected their enemies to withdraw with more dignity. The civilian spectators, who had come from Washington to witness Union victory, found themselves caught in the maelstrom of defeat. Congressmen and socialites, who had been enjoying their picnic lunches, suddenly discovered Confederate cavalry bearing down on their observation points. Carriages that had carried opera glasses and champagne bottles were now racing for safety, their occupants clinging desperately to their seats as drivers whipped their horses into frantic gallops. Senator Benjamin Wade, who had arrived that morning, expecting to witness the war's triumphant conclusion, found himself helping to push an overturned carriage off the roadway. While Confederate artillery shells whistled overhead, the genteel ladies in silk dresses were reduced to hiking up their skirts and running through the Virginia dust, their elaborate hairstyles disheveled and their faces streaked with tears and perspiration. Confederate pursuit, however, proved less devastating than it might have been. Beauregard and Johnston's forces were almost as disorganized by victory as the Union Army was by defeat. Southern regiments had become scattered during the day's fighting, their officers struggling to reassemble coherent units. Many Confederate soldiers were more interested in plundering the abandoned Union equipment than pursuing fleeing enemies. Still, the psychological damage was immense. What had begun as a confident march to end the rebellion had become a humiliating stampede back to the safety of Washington's fortifications. The myth of Union military superiority, carefully cultivated by Northern newspapers and politicians, lay shattered in the Virginia dust, alongside abandoned muskets and overturned wagons. By sunset, the roads leading back to Washington resembled the aftermath of a natural disaster. Thousands of soldiers, civilians, and vehicles streamed northward in complete disorder, leaving behind them the first battlefield of what everyone now realized would be a long and terrible war. The reckoning was about to begin. As darkness fell over the Virginia countryside on July 21st, the magnitude of the Union disaster became clear to both sides. Confederate soldiers wandered across the battlefield in amazement, gathering abandoned equipment and marveling at their unexpected victory. They found enough small arms to equip several regiments, dozens of artillery pieces, hundreds of horses, and supply wagons filled with everything from ammunition to medical supplies to personal letters from home. But the human cost told the real story of Bull Run's significance. Union casualties totaled nearly 900 men, 460 killed, wounded, or missing. Confederate losses were slightly lower at just under 400. For armies that had never experienced large-scale combat, these numbers seemed catastrophic. Field hospitals on both sides overflowed with wounded soldiers, many of whom would die in the coming days from infections and complications that 19th century medicine could not treat. The political earthquake in Washington began almost immediately. President Abraham Lincoln, who had reluctantly approved McDowell's offensive against his better judgment, now faced the collapse of his entire military strategy. The widespread belief that one decisive battle would end the rebellion had been shattered as completely as the Union Army itself. Northern newspapers that had predicted easy victory were forced to confront the reality that the Confederacy possessed both the will and ability to fight. Lincoln spent the night of July 21st in the War Department telegraph office, receiving fragmentary reports of the disaster. The president's private secretary, John Hay, would later write that Lincoln appeared greatly depressed as the full scope of the defeat became apparent. The political pressure was immediate and intense. Republican senators demanded explanations. Democratic newspapers spoke of Lincoln's incompetence. Foreign observers began questioning whether the United States government could survive a prolonged civil war. General McDowell, the architect of the failed offensive, found himself the target of vicious criticism from all quarters. Politicians who had pressured him to advance before his troops were ready now blamed him for the resulting catastrophe. The press, which had hailed him as a military genius just days earlier, now portrayed him as a bungling amateur. His military career, which had seemed so promising before Bull Run, was effectively over. The transformation of public opinion in both North and South was immediate and profound. Southern newspapers proclaimed the battle as proof that Confederate soldiers were superior fighters who could defeat any number of Yankees. The Richmond Examiner declared that the superiority of the Southern soldier has been established. Beyond question, Confederate morale soared as recruitment offices filled with volunteers, eager to strike another blow against the invading Yankees. According to accounts preserved in the Southern Historical Society papers, the psychological impact of First Bull Run convinced many Southerners that independence was not only possible, but inevitable, fundamentally altering the conflict's trajectory. In the North, however, the defeat produced a mixture of shock, anger, and grim determination. The romantic illusions about warfare that had characterized the war's early months died on the fields of Virginia. Northern newspapers began calling for a more serious approach to the conflict, including longer enlistments, better training, and more competent leadership. The Chicago Tribune wrote that the country demands that this war be prosecuted with vigor and skill. Perhaps most significantly, Bull Run convinced Lincoln that the war would be longer and more costly than anyone had imagined. Within days of the battle, he signed legislation authorizing the enlistment of 500,000 three-year volunteers. The era of 90-day soldiers and amateur warfare was ending. The Union would need professional armies led by competent generals if it hoped to suppress the rebellion. The Confederate victory at Bull Run also had unintended consequences that would ultimately work against Southern interests. The ease of their triumph bred overconfidence among Confederate leaders, who began believing their soldiers were inherently superior to Northern troops. This dangerous illusion would lead to strategic miscalculations in future campaigns. Moreover, the victory convinced European powers to maintain neutrality rather than recognizing Confederate independence, as they preferred to wait and see whether the South could sustain its military success. The battle that was supposed to end the war had instead guaranteed it would continue for years. The aftermath of First Bull Run cast a shadow that would stretch across for years of unprecedented carnage and ultimately reshape the American nation. In the immediate wake of the battle, both sides began the massive mobilization efforts that would transform a relatively minor conflict into the world's first modern industrial war. The illusions of July 21st that courage alone would determine victory, that gentlemanly warfare would prevail, that the conflict would end quickly died in the Virginia dust. Alongside the battle's casualties, for the Union, Bull Run marked the beginning of a painful but necessary education in the realities of warfare. Lincoln moved swiftly to address the military failures that had led to disaster, replacing McDowell with Major General George McClellan, a young engineer who had shown promise in minor engagements in Western Virginia. McClellan's appointment signaled a new seriousness about military professionalism. The days when political connections could secure Army commands were ending, replaced by a more merit-based system that would eventually produce the generals Grant, Sherman, Thomas, Sheridan who would win the war. The President also began the process of transforming the Union's war aims. Before Bull Run, Lincoln had insisted the conflict was simply about preserving the Union and returning wayward states to their proper relationship with the federal government. The battle's outcome convinced him that a more revolutionary approach would be necessary. The Confederacy had demonstrated both the will and capability to wage sustained warfare, which meant the Union would need to strike at the economic and social foundations of Southern resistance. Within months of Bull Run, Union strategy began evolving toward what would become known as Hard War, the systematic destruction of the Confederacy's ability to wage conflict. This meant targeting not just Confederate armies but the railroads, factories, and agricultural resources that sustained them. It also meant, eventually, striking at slavery itself, the institution that provided the labor force essential to Confederate war production. The Confederate victory, meanwhile, produced a dangerous complacency that would prove costly in the long term. Southern leaders interpreted Bull Run as confirmation that their soldiers possessed inherent advantages over Northern troops: superior fighting spirit, better leadership, familiarity with firearms and outdoor life. This led to strategic overconfidence that manifested in decisions to fight offensive battles against superior Union numbers and resources. More importantly, the victory convinced many Confederate politicians that European recognition and intervention were inevitable. Surely, they reasoned, Britain and France would recognize the legitimacy of a nation that could defeat Union armies so decisively. This expectation led to a diplomatic strategy that relied too heavily on foreign intervention, rather than building sustainable domestic strength. Historical analysis compiled in the Centennial History of the Civil War demonstrates that Bull Run's psychological impact proved more significant than its tactical results, establishing patterns of thought and behavior that would influence both sides throughout the conflict. The battle also marked the beginning of America's transformation from a loose confederation of states into a modern nation-state. The massive mobilization efforts required to fight the war would create new federal institutions, establish the precedent for national conscription, and fundamentally alter the relationship between citizen and government. The United States that emerged from the war would be radically different from the Republic that had existed before Bull Run. For the individual soldiers who survived the battle, July 21, 1861, remained a defining moment for the rest of their lives. Veterans of both armies would gather at reunions decades later, still trying to make sense of what had happened that summer day in Virginia. Many spoke of how the battle had destroyed their innocence about warfare, replacing romantic notions with hard knowledge of what modern combat actually entailed. The civilian spectators who had come to watch the war's end instead witnessed its true beginning. Their panicked flight back to Washington became a symbol of how completely the conflict had exceeded everyone's expectations. The era of genteel warfare, where battles were fought by professional armies while civilian life continued undisturbed, was ending. Total war was beginning. First Bull Run thus stands as more than just the opening major battle of the Civil War. It was the moment when Americans North and South began to understand the price they would pay for their political differences. The dreams of quick victory and easy resolution died that day, replaced by the grim recognition that the conflict would require resources, sacrifices, and moral commitments that no one had imagined possible. The battle that was supposed to end the war had instead revealed its true character, a struggle that would consume over 600,000 lives and transform the United States forever.